know, my mother works in an office in science childhood. I have seen how people can be treated there. This isn't just content for the sake of use, it's a story based on real experiences, so that you can learn about yourself and, most importantly, so that you don't repeat other people's mistakes. All names, companies, and addresses in this story are fictional.
The coat hit my keyboard before I even turned around. "Grab my coffee and set up the tech," she said, like she was ordering room service. Her voice had that kind of forced brightness people use when they're used to being obeyed. I looked up. Riley Grant. The new VP, designer bag, immaculate blazer, platform heels that didn't match our concrete hallways. She'd arrived 15 minutes late, then made her entrance like the rest of us were props. Without breaking stride, she added, "Boards for people with real resumes," and stepped into the executive suite. She hadn't said hello, hadn't asked who I was, and that was her first mistake. I didn't touch her coffee, didn't correct her, just lifted her coat off my keyboard, folded it, not for her, for the hardware, and slid it onto the unused chair behind me. Then I opened the console she'd walked past without even noticing. It wasn't just the tech. It was the command stack I had built from scratch across 6 consolidated platforms and 3 acquisitions. The platform she now technically ran. The platform that ran her. By the way, if you're one of the 97% of people listening who haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to hit the subscribe button and like the video. It genuinely helps our team keep bringing stories like this to life. Back then, I was the infrastructure lead. That's what they called me in the org chart anyway. But my name didn't appear in pitch decks or funding memos. I didn't pose for glossy LinkedIn updates, and I sure as hell wasn't looped into the ribbon-cutting announcements that came with every new strategic VP hire like Riley. I preferred it that way. Quiet, low profile, operational. Because I wasn't just maintaining servers. I was the last surviving architect from the old company, the one before the mergers, the one before we went public. Back when we operated out of a second-hand co-working lease near the river and meetings were done around an old fold-out table that creaked every time someone leaned in. When that version of the company was 2 months from shutting down, they didn't hire a savior. They contracted one. Me. And I didn't just fix bugs. I rewrote the whole damn foundation. I built the middleware stack that later became our proprietary advantage, designed the authentication relay systems that let us pass compliance in 4 different countries. And when the finance guys wanted to spin out liabilities during our first pre-Series A injection, I gave them something better than a workaround. I gave them Ellington Systems. On paper, it was a white label ops partner. In reality, it was mine. Quietly cross-signed, built to blend in, and perfectly nested between vendor dependencies no one ever fully audited. Not even the auditors. That was the shell through which I controlled every admin credential, every system override, every integration clause the new execs never bothered to read. Riley certainly didn't. While she was busy running PR with press releases and trying to impress board members who secretly thought she was a little too glossy for ops, I was right there, 2 doors down, watching her log in, watching her violate her own delegation path, watching her pile on exceptions in the access protocol just to get dashboard speed. And when she tripped clause 18C, I didn't lift a finger, didn't warn her, didn't give her a chance to fix it, because that clause wasn't designed to help. It was a trap. She had no idea who I really was, no clue what I built, no understanding of how many layers beneath her desk I had laid the wiring. But I did. And that day, when she threw her coat on my keyboard and dismissed me like a coffee intern, she flipped a switch she couldn't see, and it was already too late. Back then, the building had no badge scanners, no biometric check-ins, no security contractors standing by with iPads pretending to know your name. Just a scuffed wooden door with a keypad that barely worked and a paper sign taped to the front. Please knock. Elevator broken again. That's what I walked into in February 2015. I wasn't hired. There was no HR screening, no reference check. I was contracted, barely, by a desperate founder with a stammer in his voice and a 5-day countdown before the cloud billing cut them off. They didn't even offer me a chair. I brought my own. The entire back end was a Frankenstein mess of duct-taped APIs, half-baked billing logic, and middleware so brittle that one server hiccup brought the whole platform down. Their lead dev had already quit. The product lead was moonlighting at another startup. They didn't need a fix. They needed a resurrection. I didn't show them a resume. I opened a terminal. 12 hours later, they had a heartbeat. 36 hours after that, they had staging redundancy. I didn't leave. I kept rebuilding. Silently. Obsessively. Not because I believed in the company, but because I loved what control felt like when no one was watching. See, most people think influence comes from visibility, titles, speaking slots, LinkedIn endorsements. They're wrong. Control lives in the shadows, in the call stacks and authorization chains, in the vendor contracts no one reads and the exception paths hard-coded to temporary. That's where I did my real work. I rebuilt their infrastructure from the ground up, compliance layering, modular container routing, encrypted proxy sequencing across all customer data. I did it all without asking permission. They didn't have time for permission. But I didn't stop at the systems. The company was drowning in legacy debt, contracts, obligations, NDAs, indemnities from a failed partnership. Their attorney proposed an asset spin-out. I offered a better idea. An operational carve-out via a third-party vendor structure, clean, compliant, and invisible. I registered an LLC, Ellington Systems, Delaware-based silent shareholder structure, no active website. On the books, Ellington handled vendor integration, infrastructure maintenance, and redundancy support. In reality, it became the keystone holding the company's architecture upright. Through Ellington, I embedded a governance clause, quietly mirrored in the original continuity agreement, cross-referenced via a trust I controlled. They didn't ask questions. They were just grateful the lights stayed on. And over time, founders rotated out. The board changed. New investors arrived. The company went from survival to growth to acquisition target. The building changed. The desks got nicer. The people louder. But Ellington remained. The contract was never rescinded, the governance clause never expired, and the credential structure, built into the guts of every admin layer, still pointed to me. The younger execs never knew. HR barely had my file. My badge still worked, but no one ever stopped to wonder why, especially not Riley. She probably thought Ellington was just another dusty vendor name on a list. Probably clicked accept on some system prompt without reading the permissions. Probably assumed that the infrastructure she was now leading had been built by interns and long-forgotten consultants. She never even Googled it. If she had, she might have noticed the filings. The tax ID, the trustee record tied to an older name, mine. But she didn't. And that's the difference between a resume and a root credential. She brought the resume. I built the roots. I didn't say a word, just watched. Riley swept into meetings like a storm in a tailored blazer, correcting people mid-sentence, talking over engineers who'd been there longer than she'd been in fintech. Every discussion became an audition for attention. Hers. Every suggestion from ops was either too slow, too legacy, or too risk-averse for her taste. So I let her perform. Let her strut and swagger and copy-paste recycled solutions from her last job. I nodded when she dismissed concerns, stayed silent when she rolled her eyes at anything with the word governance in it. Let her think I was just another shadow in a corner office that didn't matter. But in the background, I was logging. Every time she forced an override to expedite provisioning, logged. Every time she turned off multi-factor auth to speed up onboarding, flagged. Each time she demanded an unlocked environment to impress some vendor on a demo, captured. You'd be surprised how much metadata lives in the margin of a quiet network. There's a difference between access and authority. Riley had the first, I had the second. And when she bypassed the delegation protocol for the first time, when she rerouted a credential chain directly through the super admin path instead of requesting a layered pass, I knew she'd just pulled the pin. Clause 18C was buried deep in the founding governance docs, not in the board-approved version, not in the redlined PDF that lived on the company wiki. This clause was signed in ink back when the company had 3 employees and 1 bank account that didn't always clear. It stated, clearly, irrevocably, that any unauthorized direct bypass of custodial credentials would trigger a failsafe. Not immediately, not loudly. Silently. A chain of stored procedures I'd embedded into the back end years ago quietly lit up. They didn't shut anything down. That would have been dramatic. They didn't send alerts to the security team. That would have tipped her off. Instead, they did something better. They documented. They traced. They time-stamped. And then they sent a secure packet, encrypted with a key Riley didn't even know existed, to a secondary logging vault tied directly to Ellington Systems. My vault. My keys. From that point on, her every digital breath was mirrored. She thought she was moving fast. She thought she was fixing things. What she was really doing was building a case against herself with each click. That's the thing about systems. You can dazzle a boardroom. You can spin up 1,000 dashboards and flood Slack with catchphrases. But infrastructure doesn't care if you smile. It doesn't care if you have influence. It just runs. And mine was running perfectly. By the end of week 2, she'd triggered 5 distinct policy violations. By the end of week 3, she'd rewritten an escalation path to remove compliance review from major vendor swaps. By the end of week 4, she was planning a system migration without even consulting the architecture team. Each violation neatly itemized, each infraction tied to an exact login, every IP address geolocated, every command hashed and verified. And then, finally, she entered her own name into the permissions core and assigned herself as sole operational lead for an integration platform tied to high-risk client data. The system paused. The logic chain evaluated the override, and the trigger fired. No alarms, no blinking lights, just one message sent quietly to the ethics continuity server under the authority of Custodial Clause 18C. Governance breach. Custodian signature required. Freeze pending. It was done. She didn't even feel it. But the company had just changed hands, and she hadn't even noticed. It happened on a Thursday, just past noon. Riley was prepping for some vendor call, new automation suite, flashy UI, overpriced nonsense. She was in the middle of demanding sandbox access with no guardrails when the console stopped responding. At first, she assumed it was a glitch, hit refresh, tried another route, asked her assistant to ping IT, but the system didn't blink. It didn't crash, didn't freeze, it just didn't allow further edits. The options were grayed out, permissions revoked. Quietly, completely. Across the hall, I received the confirmation I'd been waiting for. The audit log package had transmitted, clean, compressed, and legally compliant, directly to internal counsel under the ethics continuity mandate. That mandate was signed into policy back when our first investor came on board. It stated that any credential level breach tied to governance delegation must immediately freeze operational changes until reviewed by the designated custodian. That custodian was still listed in the system, and the name on file hadn't changed since 2015. Me. The system recognized it, the legal architecture validated it, and the freeze went into effect without a single human decision required. No one needed to shout. No one even needed to know yet, except Riley. She called the CTO loudly. I heard her through 2 walls and a closed door. I didn't move. He didn't answer right away. Let her voicemail stack. Then, finally, he responded with a screenshot and 1 sentence. Governance lock active per clause 18C, see custodian on record. Attached was the credentials dashboard. 1 line, center screen, primary custodian, E. Maddox, no title, no role, just a name. She called again, this time angrier, clipped, demanded an override, asked why no one had informed her about this ancient clause, tried to claim it was outdated, irrelevant, inapplicable to her division. But governance doesn't care about feelings. The CTO sent her 1 more message. You inherited systems you didn't build. This is one of them. That was the moment Riley realized she wasn't in control. She wasn't leading the platform. She'd been operating inside something designed before her arrival, something built to resist exactly this kind of arrogance. I didn't answer my phone, didn't respond to the quiet ping she finally sent late that evening. Can we talk? There was nothing to talk about, because she didn't trigger a freeze, she unlocked a protocol. And now, nothing. No deployment, no vendor contract, no access escalation could move without one specific thing, my sign-off. The message came through just after 9:17 p.m. subject line, unexpected authority? It was from Alan Trask, chair of the board, the kind of man who measured words like currency and didn't spend unless it moved markets. He was the board's North Star, composed, analytical, rarely surprised. So the 4 words he wrote said more than 1,000 could've. We need to talk. I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back. You were never meant to be. 3 minutes later, my phone rang. No small talk, no preamble. "I've been reviewing today's freeze report," Alan said, his tone neutral but clipped. "It names you as the custodian. Can you confirm that's not an error?" I opened the directory I hadn't touched in years, pulled the folder marked Transfer Chain, Ellington, Opshell, dragged it into a secure vault, generated an access key, and paused. "It's not an error," I said. "But it's not new either." He exhaled, the kind of sound someone makes when rebalancing expectations. "Walk me through it." So I did. I explained the back-end contract from 2015, the carve-out that became Ellington Systems, the trust deed transferring control through a nested structure into Opshell Infrastructure, our listed systems vendor, still on retainer, and how, through a mirrored governance clause, the operational authority had never lapsed. It had simply been unused. Until now. I walked him through the trust agreement, the chain of title, the indemnity clause built into the compliance envelope, how every upgrade, every expansion, every acquisition had layered on top of the original systems I had built, without ever removing the foundation I controlled. And then I shared the file I knew he hadn't seen yet. File name, violation summary, executive credential breach. It was 10 pages long. Time-stamped log entries, IP traces, access privilege escalations. Each instance where Riley Grant bypassed compliance protocols. Each violation of delegation order. Each override she had pushed through without review. At the bottom, one line, Clause 18C, trigger, executed 4:02 p.m., custodian lock active. Alan was quiet for a long time. "Why now?" he finally asked. "Why enforce it?" "Because she assumed no one beneath her mattered," I said, "and she proved it 5 times. Another pause. "Why not bring it to me first?" "Because systems don't need permission to respond," I said. "They just follow rules. She broke them. The system responded." He didn't argue, didn't defend her, didn't ask me to retract anything. Instead, he asked for one more thing. "Tomorrow morning, full access ledger, board-only channel. I want everything you've got." I sent it before we ended the call. No threats, no performance, just architecture, records, facts. Because in the end, the most powerful moves don't shout. They whisper, inside the systems that remember everything. The boardroom smelled like money, polished wood, fresh leather, and the subtle cologne of power that didn't sweat. Riley walked in like it was any other Tuesday, chin high, folder under her arm, her assistant trailing behind her with 2 phones and a reusable coffee cup that probably cost more than my first laptop. She didn't even glance at me, took her seat at the head of the table like she owned it, smiled at Alan, nodded at the legal counsel, and started organizing her notes as if this was just another strategy sync. She didn't notice the tension, didn't register the way the CFO kept his eyes on the table, how the GC avoided eye contact, how the board secretary had a new notepad open, labeled emergency session. Alan didn't waste time. He tapped the digital nameplate on his tablet. The room quieted. "Before we begin," he said, calm and clear, "there's a procedural item we need to address, brought forward under Clause 18C of our original governance structure." That was the first time I saw Riley's expression shift. Subtle, barely a flicker, but her hands froze above the paper she'd been straightening. Alan continued. "There has been a breach in credential delegation, multiple, in fact, bypassed custodial pathways, unapproved access escalation. As per the ethics continuity mandate, a reversal is pending vote." Riley blinked. The room remained still. I sat 2 seats to her left. Didn't speak. Didn't move. She looked at me then, finally, like she was seeing a ghost she thought had been exorcised long ago. "Wait," she started. "You—" I just nodded. That's all it took. The GC slid the memo forward. The lead compliance officer tapped his stylus once and passed it down. Alan raised his hand. "All in favor of immediate credential reversion under the clause." Hands lifted one by one, steady, measured, not angry, resolute. 8 votes, then a 9th. Only one abstained, a legacy investor who never liked confrontation. "Motion passes," Alan said. Riley sat there, mouth slightly open, still catching up. No one yelled. No one stormed out. It wasn't that kind of coup. This wasn't revenge. It was procedure. Within minutes, her access was revoked. Her admin tokens scrubbed. Her pending contracts flagged for review. The board secretary recorded it all without a single raised voice. I watched her fumble through her folder, trying to pivot, to argue, to make sense of a protocol she'd never bothered to read. But it was already over. She hadn't been voted out because they didn't like her. She'd been voted out because the system she trampled had rules, and the rules remembered. I didn't sit in her chair, didn't move into her office, didn't swap nameplates, didn't parade around like I'd won something. I wasn't interested in a title. I never had been. The system didn't care what you were called. It only cared if you understood it. So I appointed someone who did. Her name was Olivia Tran, sharp, quiet, methodical. She didn't wear power like a costume, didn't confuse noise with leadership. She'd been buried in our infrastructure team for years, overlooked because she didn't ask for attention. But she understood how the machine worked, because she helped build it. The board approved her immediately. No speeches, no pushback. Just a silent acknowledgement that we needed something real again. The first week was triage. We ran a full credential sweep. Anything Riley had touched, undone. Her access logs, archived, locked, and scrubbed from active systems. The vendor contracts she rushed through without legal review, frozen. The ones she rewrote entirely, voided. Then we moved to internal damage control. We reached out to the vendors she ghosted, apologized to the compliance consultants she dismissed, reinstated the audit checkpoints she called paranoid. Legal Ray-Ran risk assessments on every deployment she initiated without proper handoff. Most were salvageable. A few weren't. But we fixed it. Quietly. Thoroughly. Olivia sat across from department heads and just listened. No slides, no jargon. She asked questions Riley never thought to ask. Why did this break? Who did we forget to loop in? What were you afraid to say before? And slowly, the machine began to hum again. Then came the memo. HR issued it after internal counsel finalized the report. It was short, clinical, unambiguous. All operational changes made without delegated authority under Clause 18C are nullified. No exceptions. All systems revert to pre-breach configurations effective immediately. No finger-pointing, no dramatic language. Just one cold line that erased every decision Riley had made without understanding the structure she was trying to command. The developers didn't cheer, but they did breathe easier. The compliance team started attending meetings again, without being told to stay in their lane, and vendors stopped forwarding contracts with red flag language written in marketing speak. We didn't throw a party. We didn't issue a press release. There was no need to gloat, because we weren't rebuilding for pride. We were restoring precision, stability, discipline, everything Riley never valued, everything she thought was outdated, everything that quietly had kept the company alive long before she ever walked in with that coat. The air in the boardroom felt different now, cleaner, sharper, the kind of quiet that comes when a place has been scrubbed of theater and filled with function. 6 weeks had passed. No announcements had been made, no rebrands, no speeches about culture shifts or new eras. We didn't need any. The people who understood the company felt the difference in the way things stopped breaking, in the silence of Slack threads that no longer burst with confusion, in the clarity of a system finally breathing without strain. I walked in through the same door Riley once used like a stage entrance. No one stood. No one gasped. They just nodded. The same admin who once rolled her eyes at me when Riley barked orders without context now stood to offer coffee. This time, she didn't even hesitate. Just lifted the thermos, eyes calm, chin slightly dipped in something like quiet acknowledgement. I declined with a smile. The board was already seated. Olivia sat near the center, laptop open, glasses perched low, typing notes as Alan reviewed quarterly projections. The GC was there, so was the CFO, and even Daniel from audit, who rarely left his floor. And then, at the far end of the table, almost tucked into the shadow of the wall-mounted screen, was Riley. No nameplate. No title. She'd been invited as an observer, a courtesy extended by a board member who still thought she deserved a chance to learn from the experience. She sat rigid, eyes straight ahead, lips pressed into that same line I remembered from her first day, the one she used when people didn't fall in line fast enough. But no one was looking at her now. I walked to my seat, an old one, never reassigned, placed my folder on the table and opened it. Inside were her logs. Every breach, every override, every escalation she authorized without understanding what she was activating. A full chain of her digital footprints across the infrastructure she'd believed was hers to command. I didn't raise my voice, didn't turn it into a moment. I simply slid the folder forward, its contents already mirrored in the board's secure archive, and looked across the room. "Welcome to my company," I said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a statement of ownership in the traditional sense. It was just a reminder that she had walked into a place she never understood, tried to take over something that was never hers, and now sat in the same room without a voice, without access, and without the illusion of power. She didn't respond, didn't fidget, didn't reach for the folder. She just sat there, back stiff, breathing carefully, absorbing the silence she used to fill with noise. No one else said anything either, because everyone understood. The reversal had already happened. All that remained was the quiet weight of what couldn't be undone. A few months later, long after the freeze was lifted and the logs had been archived, I got a message from Olivia. No subject line, just a link. It was Riley's new professional update. She'd taken the LinkedIn route, complete with the glossy headshot and curated language. Excited to advise early-stage founders on operational discipline and leadership structure, it read. Bringing lessons from high-growth environments and executive leadership to the next generation of builders. I stared at the screen for a moment, not out of spite, out of curiosity. There it was again. The posture, the performance, a rebrand in heels and buzzwords, stripped of any mention of what had actually happened. No reflection, no humility, no trace of the system she'd broken or the silence that had swallowed her authority whole. The comments were polite at first. Wishing you the best on this journey, excited to see where you land next. But one reply stopped the scroll. It was from our lead counsel, Jenna, precise, razor sharp. She'd written just one line. Start by learning who owns the infrastructure next time. No emojis, no hashtags, no signature flourish. Just the kind of line that cuts cleaner than any public statement ever could. There were no replies under it, no back and forth. Just a space where conversation could have happened, but didn't. I didn't share it, didn't respond. I just bookmarked the page and closed the tab. That's how these things end. Not with fireworks, not with applause, just with quiet accountability baked into the permanence of search engines and screenshots. She could rewrite her bio, she could pivot, reposition, network. But people remember. They remember the boardroom silence. They remember the vote. They remember the day she brought down her own career with a keystroke and a smirk. She thought I was the IT guy. I was the founder she bypassed, with her own credentials as the trigger.
모자 벗어.
뭐야, 추워.
나잖아.
이거 뭐 매운 거 먹어서 그래.
한 개 더 남았는데 먹을 거야?
지우.
원희 물결표님이 저녁 매운 거 못 드시더만 이제 드시네.
땀 질질질질 나잖아. 어? 매운 거 못 먹는데 빨간 걸 좋아해.
원희 물결표님이 매운 거 먹으니 땀도 나고 딱딱하시지.
그럼.
머선 일은
아우.
매운 거는 못 먹는데 빨간 걸 좋아하니. 빨간 거 먹어. 그래야 따뜻해.
원희 물결표님의 해피피크.
화장실 가까워도 괜찮아?
괜찮아, 저기 화장실 있어.
화장실 되게 따뜻해.
어.
지금 완전 만족하다.
원희 물결표님이 화장실 비대 있다.
비데 있어도 밖에서는 비데 못 쓰겠어. 괜히 깔짝지근해.
찝찝해.
근데 다들 식사는 하셨나요? 따따.